On a freezing Mississippi night in 1863, a young enslaved maid named Clara made a choice that would echo in whispers for generations. As her mistress descended into the root cellar, Clara followed silently and then sealed the heavy door shut. What happened that night on a plantation near Vicksburg remains one of the most chilling stories of defiance. Stay with us and don't forget to like, share, subscribe and hit the bell icon for more untold tales of American history. The story of Clara begins not in the root cellar, but in the troubled heart of Mississippi. In the city of Vicksburg, during the winter of 1863, Vicksburg sat high on the bluffs of the Mississippi River, its steep hills overlooking one of the most important waterways in the nation. Whoever controlled the river controlled trade, supply lines, and survival. That winter, the city was caught in the tightening grip of the Civil War. Union forces closed in from the north and west, while Confederate families clung to what little security they could find behind walls of brick and earth. Hunger and fear haunted every household. Plantations just outside the city reflected the same sense of desperation. These estates, once built on cotton wealth and slave labor, now suffered shortages of food and fuel. Wagons that once carried harvest to riverboats now sat idle. Smokehouses grew empty, barns fell silent, and every gust of cold wind carried whispers of defeat. For the enslaved men and women who worked these lands, survival had always been a struggle, but war had sharpened their misery. Their owners demanded more, yet offered even less. Clara lived in this world. She was young, perhaps no more than 17 or 18. Born into bondage, she had never known freedom. Her place was in the household, moving quietly through shadowed halls, serving meals, tending to linens, and answering the endless commands of her mistress. To those around her, she was almost invisible, a figure carrying trays, sweeping ashes, or pouring water into basins. Yet behind her lowered eyes and silent presence, Clara carried her own thoughts, her own hurts, and her own longing for something better than chains. Life for an enslaved maid was a constant test of endurance. From the first light of morning until the last candle burned low at night, Clara was on call. She polished the silver that no longer gleamed, washed clothes in icy water, and followed her mistress through the house like a shadow. Mistakes were not tolerated. A dish chipped, a floor left unswept, a garment scorched by the iron each could bring harsh words, a slap, or worse. Clara learned to hold her tongue, to swallow her pride, and to bury her anger deep inside where no one could see. The town of Vicksburg itself offered no comfort. By 1863, it had become a city under siege. Union gunboats prowled the river, and soldiers camped in the hills. Food grew scarce. Prices soared beyond reason. A sack of flour cost more than a soldier's wages. Families dug into cellars and caves carved from the clay hills, hiding from shells that rained down from above. For the wealthy, these cellars were a shield. For Clara and others like her, they were another reminder of their master's power, the locked places they could enter but never truly claim as their own. Winter worsened these hardships. Mississippi winters were not the frozen storms of the north, but they carried their own bite. Nights dipped below freezing, frost crept over fields, and icy winds howled through cracks in the wooden cabins where enslaved families huddled together. Fires burned low for lack of fuel. Thin blankets offered little protection. Every morning, Clara woke with stiff fingers, her breath visible in the dim light of the kitchen hearth. While her mistress wrapped herself in layers of wool and fur, Clara shivered in worn garments that barely held the warmth. Yet even in these conditions, duty never ceased. The mistress expected Clara to fetch and carry, to kneel and serve, to appear calm even when exhaustion pressed down on her shoulders. To refuse was unthinkable. To falter was dangerous. Clara learned to endure in silence, yet her silence was not emptiness. It was a gathering storm, a quiet strength waiting for its moment. Every enslaved person carried such storms within them, whispers of rebellion, sparks of courage, the knowledge that their lives were worth more than their masters admitted. For Clara, the war outside Vicksburg was distant thunder. The real battle was inside the walls of the plantation house, in the narrow spaces between command and obedience, cruelty and survival. That battle grew sharper as the winter deepened. And as the mistress grew colder, not only in the chill of the season, but in the cruelty of her heart, Dotted was in this crucible of war. Hunger and cold that Clara's choice would be forged. A choice no one saw coming. A choice that would transform a root cellar into the stage of defiance. And a choice that would mark Clara's name in the shadows of American history. The mistress of the house was a woman who carried herself with the pride of old Southern bloodlines. Even as the war drained her fortune and the plantation slipped into hardship, she held her chin high, her voice sharp, and her demands constant. To the neighbors who sometimes visited, she appeared as a lady of refinement, straight-backed, neatly dressed, a woman who kept her home in order despite the chaos beyond her gates. But to those who served her, especially Clara, she was something else entirely, unyielding, cold, and cruel in ways that cut deep. She had grown up in comfort, shielded from the realities of labor. Servants had dressed her, cooked her meals, and carried her burdens. That upbringing taught her not gratitude but entitlement. She had never questioned her right to command, never doubted her place above the men and women she called her property. To her, Clara was not a person with feelings, dreams, or fears. She was a tool, a pair of hands to clean, a body to fetch and carry, a shadow to wait at her side. The mistress's voice carried through the halls of the house like a whip. "Clara, hurry with that firewood. Clara, fetch my shawl. Clara, you clumsy girl, watch what you're doing." Each order came with an edge, as though spoken not to a young woman, but to something less. And when Clara faltered, even for a moment, the scolding grew sharper. Some days it was endless chatter of correction, small humiliations that wore down her spirit. Other days it was sudden bursts of anger, harsh words, a shove, sometimes worse. For Clara, there was no escape from her mistress's watchful eyes. She was expected to stand nearby during meals, ready to pour water into a cup or clear away a plate at the snap of fingers. At night, when the mistress retired to her chamber, Clara was sent to fetch warm coals for the fire or to rub aching shoulders. The work itself was heavy, but the heavier burden was the constant reminder that she was owned, commanded, and stripped of dignity with every word. The mistress had her own fears that winter, though she never admitted them aloud. She heard the distant thunder of Union cannons, knew the stories of plantations burned and families driven from their homes. Yet instead of softening her heart, those fears hardened it. She clung more tightly to control, finding in Clara a target for her frustrations. If the food was short, Clara had not prepared it properly. If the house was cold, Clara had not kept the fire bright enough. If letters from her husband at the front grew scarce, Clara somehow bore the blame. In every disappointment, Clara was the nearest scapegoat. Still, Clara endured in silence. She had been taught since childhood that resistance brought punishment, that survival meant quiet obedience. Yet deep within her, the weight of years began to press against that silence. Each command, each insult, each sharp look of disdain added another stone to the load she carried in her heart. And with every day of cold winds and empty tables, that load grew harder to bear. Neighbors may have thought the mistress strong and proper, but Clara knew the truth. She knew the sharpness of the woman's tongue, the sting of her hand, the bitterness that seeped into every room of the house. A mistress might wear fine shawls and speak with careful manners, but beneath that veneer was a hardness that froze everyone around her. She was not only cold because of the winter air, she was cold in spirit, in heart, in her treatment of the young woman who served her. That winter, the mistress's cruelty seemed endless. She had no idea that with each harsh word, with each command barked into the silence, she was pushing Clara toward a decision that would change both their lives forever. The winter of 1863 settled over Mississippi like a heavy, unshakable cloak. The fields that once stretched green with cotton now lay bare, frost clinging to the dead stalks. The trees stood stripped and skeletal, their branches rattling in the cold winds that swept down from the river. The air was sharp, biting at skin and stinging at lungs. Nights fell early, and mornings rose gray and bleak. For those on the plantation, every day was a struggle to keep warm, to keep fed, and to keep hope alive. Food was dwindling. The barns that once overflowed with corn and hay now echoed hollow and empty. The smokehouse no longer carried the rich smell of salted pork or smoked hams. Instead, shelves in the cellar held only a few jars of pickled vegetables, some sacks of cornmeal, and roots pulled from the hard-ground turnips, onions, potatoes. Each item was precious, guarded closely by the mistress, who rationed them with suspicion. She counted every jar, measured every scoop of flour, and accused Clara or the other servants of waste if the stores seemed to shrink. The root cellar became the heart of survival. Built into the earth beneath the house, its cool walls once kept food fresh through the long southern summers. Now, in the dead of winter, it became a vault of scarcity. Clara was often sent there with a lantern in hand to fetch what little remained, a jar of beans, a strip of dried meat, or a small bundle of roots. She would descend the narrow steps into the damp, earthen-smelling darkness, her breath hanging in the chill air, her fingers trembling as she searched the shelves. Each time she entered, she felt the weight of her mistress's eyes on her back, as though even in the cellar shadows she could not escape that watchful, suspicious gaze. The cold pressed harder with each passing night. Clara's cabin, shared with other enslaved women, had cracks wide enough for the wind to slip through. Thin blankets offered little warmth, and the fire in the small hearth died quickly for lack of fuel. Clara often woke shivering, her hands numb, her lips dry from the bitter air. In the big house, the mistress complained constantly about the cold, yet she had more layers of wool, thick quilts, and Clara herself to tend the fires through the night. Still, nothing seemed to satisfy her dot as supplies ran low. Tempers grew shorter. The mistress's scolding grew sharper, her eyes colder. She began to lash out at the smallest mistake a dish, set down too hard. A fire that sputtered, even Clara's quiet pace through the halls. Every failing in the household, every absence of plenty, was somehow Clara's fault. For Clara, the burden of blame became heavier than the physical labor she carried each day. She learned to brace herself for harsh words before they came, to steel her heart against insults she could not answer. Yet the cold did more than chill the body. It chilled the spirit. Clara saw it in the other enslaved workers as well. Hunched shoulders, weary faces, eyes that looked down instead of ahead. The war had brought no freedom to them yet, only more hunger, more fear, and more cruelty from masters who felt their world slipping away. Hope flickered dimly, like a candle in a draught. And yet, deep within Clara, that candle refused to go out. Every night, as she lay awake in her thin blanket, Clara thought about the cellar. She thought about the food locked inside, guarded so carefully. She thought about the mistress's endless cruelty, the sharpness of her voice, the weight of her commands. The cellar was more than a storehouse. It was a symbol of control. The mistress held the key, the power to grant or deny, the authority to open or close. Clara entered only when summoned and always under orders. But she knew the latch, she knew the door, and she knew how easily it could swing shut. The winter pressed on, harder and colder. Frost rimed the windows of the big house, and the wind howled through the trees outside. Clara went about her duties in silence, but inside her heart the gathering storm grew. Each insult from the mistress, each sharp command, each hungry night in the cabin added fuel to a fire that burned deep within her. She felt it smoldering, waiting for the moment when it would break into flame. For Clara, survival had always meant endurance. But now, endurance alone seemed not enough. The cellar, the food, the cold, all of it pressed her toward a decision she had never allowed herself to imagine. The mistress believed herself untouchable, protected by her title, her wealth, her authority. She never once considered that the quiet maid who fetched her shawl, lit her fire, and carried her burdens might one day turn against her. Yet the winter had changed Clara. Hunger had sharpened her, cruelty had hardened her, and the cold had taught her that even the proudest could be brought low. The root cellar waited, its door heavy and its latch strong. And in Clara's heart the thought began to take shape. What if the door closed and the mistress could not come out? It happened on one of the coldest nights of that long winter. The wind outside roared through the bare trees, rattling shutters and driving icy drafts through the cracks in the house. The fire in the hearth burned low, and the mistress, shivering beneath her shawl, demanded more food from the cellar. Her voice was sharp, cutting across the room as she ordered Clara to bring up turnips and a jar of beans. But then, with a suspicious glance, she rose from her chair and declared she would come along herself. She did not trust Clara alone with the dwindling stores. Clara obeyed, as she always had, fetching a lantern and leading the way down the narrow wooden stairs. The air grew colder as they descended, the damp smell of earth rising to meet them. Shadows danced on the cellar walls as the lantern flickered in Clara's trembling hand. The shelves loomed, half empty, jars lined in neat but dwindling rows, sacks slumped and thinning. It was a place that felt both like a tomb and a treasure chest, holding the last scraps that stood between the family and starvation. The mistress's footsteps echoed behind her. "Hold that lantern higher, girl," she snapped, her tone impatient. Clara lifted her arm, casting longer shadows across the shelves. The mistress moved slowly, running her fingers along the jars, counting, measuring, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Every sound she made the scrape of glass. The rustle of her skirts seemed louder than it should have been in the close. Cold space. Too much has gone missing, the mistress muttered, her voice carrying accusation. You people eat more than you admit. Lazy mouths, always hungrier than they deserve. If I find so much as one missing jar, I'll see you punished. Her words cut like blades, sharp and cold as the winter air above. Clara said nothing. She held the lantern steady, though her arm ached and she kept her gaze low, though her heart pounded hard in her chest. The mistress selected a jar with a tight, angry motion and thrust it into Clara's arms. "Take this up," she commanded, then turned back to the shelves, muttering to herself. Clara shifted under the weight, the lantern light trembling in her hand. Her eyes lifted to the stairs. The door above seemed distant, yet so close. And in her mind, the thought returned, the one that had grown stronger with each passing night. What if the door closed? What if she could not come out? The mistress bent down, searching the lower shelves. Her back turned to Clara. For a moment, the sharp tongue was silent, replaced only by the faint clink of jars and the hiss of the wind outside, seeping even here into the cold earth. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The weight of the jar pressed against her arms, but heavier still was the decision forming in her heart. She could end this. She could silence the scolding voice forever. The cellar, the cold, the hunger, these things that had chained her spirit, could become her weapon. Her heart hammered. She felt her palms grow slick with sweat, even in the chill. She looked at the door again, at the heavy wood, the iron latch that gleamed faintly in the lantern's glow. Every part of her screamed with fear. If she dared, there would be no turning back. If she faltered, punishment would be merciless. But another voice, quieter yet stronger, rose within her. Enough. Enough of the insults. Enough of the commands. Enough of the endless winter, where she was never warm, never fed, never free. The mistress's voice broke the silence again, sharp and cutting. Hurry, girl. Don't stand there like a fool. Her tone dripped with contempt, her words heavy with scorn. Clara's jaw tightened. Her fingers clenched around the jar. And in that instant, something inside her shifted. It was as if the weight of every insult, every hungry night, every frozen morning pressed her forward. She no longer felt only fear. She felt resolve. She set the jar carefully on the step. She moved slowly, silently, each motion deliberate, her eyes fixed on the door above. Behind her, the mistress still muttered, lost in her own bitterness, blind to the storm rising in the heart of the girl who had served her for so long. Clara's hand reached for the doorframe. Her fingers brushed the cold iron of the latch. And in that moment, she knew. She would not endure another winter beneath this woman's shadow. She would act. The turning point had come. The cellar was colder than the night outside. The lantern flickered, shadows stretching long across the earthen walls. Clara stood at the base of the steps, her heart pounding so loud she wondered if her mistress could hear it. The woman's back was turned, bent low as she rummaged through the lower shelves, scolding under her breath about wasted food and careless hands. Clara's breath came in short, sharp bursts. The jar she had set down trembled where it rested on the step. Her hand slid to the doorframe, fingers curling around the wood worn smooth by years of use. The iron latch above her glinted in the lantern light. It waited, heavy, final. For a moment, Clara hesitated. She had lived her whole life in silence, bowing her head, obeying every order. Her body remembered the lash, the sting of punishment, the endless fear of stepping out of line. That fear clutched at her now, whispering that this was madness, that she would be caught, that there was no escape. But another voice rose stronger inside her, a voice that had been gathering strength all winter, a voice that said enough. The mistress's voice cracked the silence again. Clara, hold that light steady, girl, or I'll have your hide. Useless as always. Her tone was sharp, dripping with the bitterness of a woman who had never once seen Clara as human. The words struck like whips, but this time they did not cut Clara down. They lifted her higher. Her hand gripped the latch, steady now, no longer trembling. She looked back once. The mistress was still bent low, skirts brushing the dirt floor, her head turned away. She did not see the change in the girl behind her. Clara drew a breath, deep and steady. Then, with one smooth motion, she pulled the door closed. The sound was deafening in the stillness, a heavy thud as the wood slammed shut, sealing the cellar's darkness. The lantern flame shivered, casting wild shadows before it was snuffed out, plunging the room into near blackness. At once, the mistress cried out, "Clara, what are you doing? Open this door." Her voice was sharp, commanding, certain of obedience. But Clara's hand was already on the iron latch. With a force born not of strength, but of resolve, she dropped it into place. A metal clanged, final and unyielding. Silence hung for a heartbeat. Then came the pounding. The mistress's fists hammered against the wood. "You wicked girl! Open it this instant!" Her voice rose, shrill, frantic. She shoved at the door, but the latch held. "Do you hear me? Open it!" Clara stood frozen on the other side, her breath sharp in the cold air. The wood shuddered under each blow, but her hand never left the latch. Her body trembled, not with fear now, but with a strange, fierce calm. She had done it. The cries inside grew louder. The mistress screamed Clara's name, cursed her, threatened her with every punishment imaginable. She clawed at the door, kicked it, shouted until her voice cracked. But Clara did not move. The cellar had become her mistress's prison, just as the house had always been hers. For the first time in her life, Clara was the one holding the power. She turned from the door. The wind outside howled through the dark, carrying the sound of her mistress's muffled pleas into the night. Clara's steps were slow, steady, each one carrying her farther from the voice that had chained her for so long. The act was done. The door was shut, and nothing would ever be the same again. The first few minutes after the latch clicked into place were the quietest Clara had ever known. The world outside the cellar was dark, silent, and frozen, except for the whistle of wind through the trees and the soft creak of branches bending under frost. But inside the cellar, chaos reigned. The mistress's voice, once controlled and commanding, rose into frantic screams. "Clara, you insolent girl! Open this door!" The pounding came next, fists striking the wood, thudding in desperate rhythm. The iron latch held firm. The door shuddered under the weight of her blows. But Clara stood motionless, her chest tight, her hands curled into fists at her sides. Each shout, each desperate plea, echoed through the walls, ricocheting off the shelves of jars and sacks. The sound was almost unbearable, yet Clara felt no fear, now only a sharp, fierce calm. She had endured scorn, insult, and endless nights of shivering in thin blankets. She had carried the weight of command without freedom, the burden of blame for mistakes she did not commit. Every harsh word from her mistress had been another stone on her back, and now, after years of endurance, the burden had transformed into action. The cellar door was no longer just a barrier. It was the boundary between oppression and defiance, between fear and power. The mistress's shouting began to change tone. At first it was anger, laced with threats. Then confusion. "Clara, what have you done?" Her voice wavered, sharp with disbelief. "Open this door? I command you." Her words faltered, uneven now, almost frightened. The realization that she was trapped helpless in the cold, dark cellar began to sink in. Outside, the wind carried the muffled sounds into the frozen night. Clara listened to the echoes, a strange weight pressing down on her heart. She felt a mixture of sorrow and relief. Sorrow for the woman she had once obeyed, and relief that the cycle of cruelty was broken, even for a single night. The winter around her seemed to deepen, as if the frozen landscape mirrored the finality of what had been done below. Time stretched slowly. The mistress pounded, cursed, shouted, and fell silent for brief, uneasy intervals. Clara stood in the cold, the wind brushing against her face, and she counted each heartbeat. Each beat was a reminder that she was alive, that she had made a choice, that she had reclaimed a fragment of control over her own life. The night pressed on, relentless in its chill, but Clara's resolve remained warmer than any fire she had tended. Hours passed. The cries and pounding gradually faded. Exhaustion began to replace panic below, as the mistress grew weak and shivering, trapped in darkness and cold. The sound of desperation dwindled, until all that remained was the muffled creak of the cellar, and the whispering wind through the trees. Outside, the world was still frozen, silent and empty witness to the act that had changed the night forever. Clara did not move toward the house. She did not look back. Each step away from the door was deliberate, slow, and steady. She felt the crunch of frost beneath her shoes, the sting of cold air in her lungs, the brush of wind against her cheeks. For the first time in her life, she walked with a freedom, born not from place, but from choice. The weight of years of oppression had lifted, if only for the night, and she carried with her a quiet, unshakable strength. The long night stretched on, and the house behind her remained silent at last. The cellar, the root of cruelty and control, had become a prison. The mistress had been silenced, and Clara had survived. And in the darkness of that Vicksburg winter, Clara's courage whispered through the frozen trees, a story that would echo long after the snow melted and the cold winds passed. Morning broke over the plantation like a hesitant promise. Pale sunlight struggled through the frost-covered windows, illuminating the house in a muted glow. The wind outside had quieted, leaving the air sharp and still. Inside, the usual sounds of a busy morning fire crackling, pots clanging, voices calling, were absent. Something felt off. Even the birds seemed to hesitate in the leafless trees. The other servants, sensing the tension, moved cautiously through the halls. Whispers filled the spaces Clara had walked so many times before. "Have you seen her?" One murmured. "The mistress. She hasn't come up yet." Footsteps grew hurried as the concern spread. Fear mingled with curiosity, for it was unusual for the mistress not to rise at the first light of day. Clara had already vanished. She was gone, leaving nothing behind but the faint footprints she had made in the frost outside, and the memory of a night no one would forget. No one knew where she had gone. Perhaps into the woods, toward the river, or simply vanished into the shadows of a war-torn land. The uncertainty added weight to the morning, and yet no one dared speak her name aloud, for the story itself was unthinkable. Attention turned to the cellar. The heavy door remained closed, the iron latch secure. Hesitation filled the air as one of the older servants approached, whispering a prayer and summoning the courage to lift the latch. It resisted at first, and gave with a reluctant creak. Darkness spilled from the opening, followed by the faint, chilling scent of cold and damp earth. Inside, they found the mistress slumped against the wall, her face pale, lips blue from the cold. The lantern lay toppled on the floor, casting weak, fractured light across the shelves. The jars and sacks were untouched, preserved as if by magic, while the woman who had controlled them now trembled, helpless. She had endured the night as best she could, but the winter had been relentless, and the prison Clara had created proved unforgiving. Shock filled the servants' eyes. They murmured to one another, afraid of speaking too loudly, afraid that the power of the event was larger than their understanding. The mistress's scolding voice, so constant and sharp, was reduced to shivering words, pleading for freedom. "Open the door." "Girl," her tone was broken, unfamiliar, human in a way it had never been before. The long night had stripped her of authority and left her exposed to fear and vulnerability. The very sensations she had inflicted upon Clara countless times. Outside, the morning air was crisp and unforgiving. The frost had hardened the ground, and the footprints Clara left behind were quickly fading under a thin layer of drifting snow. She had disappeared without a trace, leaving no clue to her fate. Did she escape to freedom? Had she found refuge among the Union lines? Or had the cold claimed her, as it had so many who dared step into the unknown? The plantation resumed its uneasy rhythm, but the event of that night lingered like a shadow over every hallway and hearth. The mistress, once untouchable, now carried a new understanding of fear and helplessness. The servants, witnesses to the impossible, held a secret knowledge of what had occurred, a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of Clara's courage. That winter morning became a story whispered among the trees and across the frost-covered fields. It was a tale of defiance, of bravery, and of a young woman who had seized control of her destiny, even if only for a single, unforgettable night. And though Clara's path was lost to history, her act remained a spark of resistance that echoed in silence through the cold halls of Vicksburg and beyond. The story of Clara of Vicksburg, is more than a tale of a single winter night. It is a story of endurance, courage, and defiance, an echo of the countless untold acts of bravery by enslaved people whose lives were bound by chains, yet whose spirits remained unbroken. In the stillness of the Mississippi winter, Clara transformed the very tools of her oppression, the heavy door, the iron latch, the darkness of the cellar into instruments of power, if only for a fleeting moment. That fleeting moment, however, was enough to remind us that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit can find a way to reclaim freedom, dignity, and self-respect. Clara's act was not the product of sudden anger or recklessness. It was the culmination of years of silent suffering, constant labor, and relentless humiliation. Each insult she endured, each harsh word from her mistress, every night spent shivering under thin blankets, had built toward a quiet but determined resolve. She had learned, through survival, that obedience was necessary, but endurance had its limits. When the moment arrived, she chose to act not out of vengeance, but out of the deep, instinctive need to reclaim her own power, if only temporarily, and to remind the world that she was more than a servant, more than property, more than a shadow in the hallways of a grand house. History often records the actions of the powerful, the wealthy, and the victorious. But Clara's story reminds us that courage does not always wear a crown or carry a sword. Sometimes courage is quiet. Sometimes it is measured in a hand gripping a latch, a step taken into the cold, a choice made in silence against authority. It is the subtle defiance, the moment of moral clarity in a life, otherwise constrained by the demands of others, that echoes longest. Clara's story survives because it is a testament to the resilience of those who have been denied a voice. The root cellar, which once represented sustenance and security for the mistress, became a symbol of the reversal of power. That night, the mistress who had wielded control so effortlessly found herself powerless, trapped by her own ignorance of the courage and determination of the young woman she had considered beneath her. It is a stark reminder that power, when wielded without empathy or justice, is fragile. Those who believe themselves untouchable may one day discover that the smallest, quietest actions can shift the balance in ways they never imagined. And yet, Clara's story does not end neatly. She vanished into the winter, leaving her fate unknown. The uncertainty of her path adds to the power of her narrative. Did she survive the night, find freedom, and live to see another day? Or did she succumb to the harshness of the winter, her courage immortalized only in whispers and the frozen footprints she left behind? History may never answer this question, but perhaps that is the point. Clara's legacy is not in the certainty of survival, but in the audacity of choice, the knowledge that one can act, even in a world designed to strip away agency, and leave a mark that resonates beyond immediate consequences. The emotional weight of her story resonates deeply, particularly for those who understand the relentless pressures of inequality and injustice. Clara's courage reminds us of the cost of silence and the value of standing firm in the face of oppression. It is an example that speaks across generations, that the most ordinary individuals can perform extraordinary acts, that history is shaped not only by generals and politicians, but by the decisions of those who refuse to be broken down. In reflecting on this tale, we also recognize the duality of history, the intertwining of cruelty and courage, suffering and triumph. The mistress, trapped in the cellar, experienced fear and vulnerability in a way she had never known. The servants who discovered her witnessed a reversal of power that would remain unspoken, a secret between the walls and shadows of the house. And Clara, whose name may have been forgotten by official records, etched her courage into the memory of those who survived to tell the story. This duality captures the essence of historical truth, that human experience is rarely simple, and that moral courage can appear in the smallest, most unexpected forms. For us today, The story of Clara of Vicksburg is a reminder of empathy, resilience, and the enduring human spirit. It is a call to acknowledge those whose lives were marginalized, whose voices were silenced, and whose acts of defiance went unrecorded in the annals of history. It challenges us to look closer, to listen more carefully, and to honor the courage that lives quietly among the shadows of the past. As we reflect on Clara's choice that winter night, we are invited to see her not merely as a figure of history, but as a symbol of enduring resistance. Her story reminds us that bravery can exist in the smallest gestures, in the quiet moments of decision, in the refusal to accept a life of subjugation. Even in the face of unimaginable oppression, Clara acted. Even in the shadow of fear, she chose agency over passivity. And though history may not reveal the full measure of her life, the courage she demonstrated transcends time, leaving an indelible mark on all who hear her story. If Clara's story moved you, take a moment to remember that history is filled with untold acts of bravery waiting to be uncovered. Like this video, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to our channel to uncover more hidden stories of America's past. Let us honor the courage of those whose voices were nearly lost and keep their memories alive for generations to come.